I have not seen or had time to look up the CFP ratings. I was at the gala all night last night when all that was going on. I guess there are some teams as Oregon fans we should be rooting for to have a home game at Autzen this year. I believe Texas Tech is the team that we should all be rooting for. I have yet to verify that because I think there are other things at hand here that is maybe a little bit higher priority to discuss in regards to the Ducks. Obviously, what's going on in the playoffs is important, sure. But here's the thing, either way, depending on Oregon's seeding, we'll basically go from 3 weeks of a bye week to 4 or just 3. So I guess depending on our seeding, we might get the team might get a first round bye, which would make it a 4-week break in between this last Saturday's game with Washington and the next game in the playoffs, or a 3-week break and a home playoff game at Autzen. I believe that is the determining factor between conference championships this weekend. I will have to look that up at a later time. For me, the bottom line is, yes, Oregon does struggle with bye weeks. It seems like there's more rust than rest than a lot of teams that are able to use bye weeks as a rest and not rust situation. However, with the level of injuries that have taken over the past month or so for Oregon, it seems we don't really have a choice. We're going to need this time off to get everyone healed up. And if they're rusty, then so be it. And let's just hope that the rust wears off quicker and is less damaging than the Rose Bowl last year. And granted, I know everyone has an issue with the level of bye weeks, and the bye weeks in particular, I guess, in the college football playoff. And largely, I agree. The numbers sort of suggest, because all teams that had a bye week last year lost. And 3 to 4 weeks seems like a long time to go without playing and then start trying to play playoff football. So I largely agree with that. They definitely need to adjust the calendar, the football calendar, to make that bye week. I mean, with football, the teams that have bye weeks, it's only 1 week. So they're back at it in 2 weeks with the bye week. So obviously that's too long. Just like, it's weird because they sort of tried to fill in the gaps of the BCS, or the final game of the regular season, the BCS National Championship, because that was like a 6-week layoff. And so the idea, obviously, with the expanded playoff was to sort of fill that gap. So you had playoffs, so teams that maybe just missed the 4-team or the BCS back in the day would have a shot still at the postseason. But also it was like, okay, now you also get better football because you're not having to wait 5-6 weeks for the national championship game. But all they really did was cut that break in half, maybe, and it's still sort of the same thing. So largely, I do agree that the schedule needs to shift a little bit to where it's not such a huge break between the regular and postseason. Even with the conference championship games, you can still play sooner and still have enough of a break for certain teams or seeding and stuff like that. So I largely agree with that. But on the other side, last year, Ohio State loses to Michigan. They don't have a conference championship game that year to attend because they missed it. And then they came back 3 weeks later, played Tennessee, and started becoming the buzzsaw in the playoff and ended up winning the national championship. So in reality, Ohio State had just as much of an excuse as Oregon or any other team with the bye week last year to have a terrible showing against Tennessee and lose that game. They had the same amount of time off in between games as everyone else. Now, certainly you could say, well, Ohio State did have a game a week before Oregon. They got back in rhythm sooner, blah, 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 so on and so forth. The other teams who played against the bye week teams also did too. Some of them maybe played in their conference championship, so on and so forth. So, but what would be stopping your team from becoming that buzzsaw even with that time off? So while there is an excuse that I largely agree with, at the same time, in terms of like the infrastructure of the playoff system and what the NCAA needs to do needs to change for sure. Everyone should have the same amount of time off around the same time. There's still sort of no excuse you can overcome that obstacle. And granted, for Oregon last year, hopefully it's become a learning experience. Maybe for the other teams it has. Sorry, I'm yawning. But nonetheless, that is the sort of situation that Oregon is looking to be experiencing in terms of how the playoff committee seeds people, obviously, starting from now and through the conference championships that are being played this weekend. So, as goes for the Big Ten, it's not really going to matter for Oregon in terms. I think their seeding is kind of locked. I don't think their seeding changes if Indiana loses because they lost to Indiana in the head-to-head. And it obviously doesn't change if Ohio State loses because Ohio State will have gone from undefeated to one loss and Oregon never played them. It would basically just be Indiana and Ohio State probably switching seedings if Indiana were to beat Ohio State. So clearly it seems the other conference championships are the reasons that we are having to root for certain teams as fans to sort of solidify our seeding in that regard. But the way that things played out proved me correct a few weeks ago, as discussed at the top of the show here, that I do know into some capacity what I'm talking about, that Oregon sort of did need to win out in November to make the playoff. And it's good that we did. And not only just because two of our teams were our rivals, we'll say. Rivals. I know USC doesn't consider us rivals. But like I said, it's a nice little rivalry that sort of would probably be Washington, Oregon State, and USC and Stanford, kind of the next tier of rivals for Oregon, if I'm being honest. But not just because they're old Pac-12 foes, I'll say. But because of the way that the playoff committee chose people, Oregon, if they were 10-2, would probably be in the situation that Vandy is right now. That's just the way it is. They were looking for any way to, one, not only shoehorn as many SEC teams in the playoff as they could, i.e. them also trying to find some sort of back door for Texas at 9-3 to get in, just like they tried last year with a 9-3 South Carolina. Because then you already had two undefeated teams going to the conference championships in the Big Ten. So Oregon couldn't win the Big Ten. And then Michigan was 10-2. Or potentially, sorry. And Michigan was potentially 10-2 even if they were able to beat Ohio State. And we didn't play Michigan, so there was no head-to-head. And then Ohio State would still have one loss. And so they would be going up against an undefeated Indiana. And then, of course, if we lost to Iowa, they potentially go 10-2. USC, that game was playoff implications. And Washington potentially have playoff implications. Oregon needed to win out. Because then, if let's say they did drop one of those games, and right now it was with a 9-3 Texas, 10-2 Vandy, 10-2 Oregon. Oregon can't win the conference championship. Vandy can't win the conference championship. Neither can Texas. Well, guess who they're going with? SEC. That's just what it would be. They would say better luck next year, Oregon.